25 years of marriage. High school sweethearts. A family everyone described as perfect. On the outside, Todd and Barbara Kendhammer looked like the kind of couple nothing could ever touch. They worked together, laughed together, raised 2 children together, and built a quiet life on a rural Wisconsin farm. Even their daughter said their marriage had no cracks. Then, on a calm Friday morning, everything ended on a country road. At 8:09 a.m., Todd Kendhammer called 911, his voice shaking as he said a metal pipe had come through the windshield and struck his wife. He said it came from an oncoming truck. He said there was nothing he could do. When police arrived, the scene seemed clear. A shattered windshield, a heavy pipe, a woman fighting for her life. At first, it looked like a terrible accident, the kind no one could see coming. But as investigators began to look closer, one question refused to go away. How does something like this happen? With no witnesses, no truck, and evidence that tells a completely different story. This is the case of Todd and Barbara Kendhammer, and the accident that never was. As we move on, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. For 25 years, Todd and Barbara Kendhammer were known as the couple who got it right. They met as teenagers in rural Wisconsin. Young, inseparable, and deeply attached to each other from the start. Friends would later say they didn't just date, they grew up together. By the time they married at 21, most people around them already assumed they were permanent. Barbara was warm, social, and deeply family-oriented. She worked part-time in a middle school cafeteria, a job she loved because it kept her close to home and close to people. Her co-workers remembered her desk filled with flowers, family photos, and little personal touches, small signs of a woman who took pride in her life. Todd worked at a metal can manufacturing plant and ran a side business repairing auto glass. It gave them flexibility. It also meant they spent a lot of time together, early mornings, shared errands, quiet drives through back roads they knew by heart. They lived on a rural property outside West Salem. Not flashy, not loud, just peaceful. They talked about buying more land. Todd built houses as side projects. Barbara helped manage the day-to-day life around them. They had 2 children, Jessica and Jordan. Both grew up believing their parents' marriage was exactly what love was supposed to look like. No yelling, no tension, no signs of trouble. Jessica would later say something that stuck with everyone who heard it. She said her parents' marriage was perfect. Not good, not strong, perfect. By 2016, they had quietly celebrated 25 years together. They had just become grandparents, financially stable, comfortable, looking ahead, not backward. There were no police calls to their home, no reports of violence, no whispers of trouble behind closed doors. To everyone who knew them, Todd and Barbara Kendhammer were proof that long-term love could actually work. Which is why, when Barbara was rushed to the hospital that September morning, no one questioned Todd's story. Because why would they? Nothing in their past suggested that the man she trusted most would be the one responsible for what happened next. Friday, September 16th, 2016 began like any other morning in rural La Crosse County. The sky was overcast. The roads were quiet. Nothing about the day suggested it would end in tragedy. Just after 7:30 a.m., Todd and Barbara Kendhammer left their home and climbed into their gray Toyota Camry. Barbara was scheduled to work that morning at the school cafeteria. But first, Todd told her they needed to stop and pick up a friend's pickup truck. He said the windshield needed repair, the kind of side job Todd had done many times before. It wasn't unusual. They often ran errands together. They liked the time alone. At 7:57 a.m., a surveillance camera on a nearby farm captured their car driving north along County Highway M. The footage showed nothing out of the ordinary. No sudden stops, no signs of distress, just a married couple heading down a familiar road. 12 minutes later, everything changed. At 8:09 a.m., emergency dispatch received a frantic call. It was Todd Kendhammer. His voice shook as he told the dispatcher that something had come through the windshield. He struggled to explain what had happened, repeating that his wife had been hit and was bleeding badly. He said she wasn't responding. According to Todd, a heavy metal pipe had fallen from an oncoming truck, shot through the air, smashed through the windshield, and struck Barbara in the head and neck. He said it happened in an instant. By the time deputies arrived, the Camry was pulled off the road, its right wheel resting in a shallow ditch. The windshield was shattered. A thick metal pipe lay nearby. Barbara was slumped in the passenger seat, unconscious and critically injured. Todd was outside the vehicle, visibly shaken, with cuts and bruises on his hands and neck. He told officers he had removed the pipe himself and tried to save his wife. To first responders, it looked like a tragic accident, rare, violent, and horrifying. But even in those first moments, there were details that didn't quite sit right. Details that would soon turn a routine crash investigation into something far more disturbing. From the moment officers began asking questions, Todd Kendhammer had an answer for everything. He explained that the pipe had come from an oncoming flatbed truck, launched into the air, and crashed through the passenger side of the windshield. He said the impact was so sudden that Barbara never had time to react. 1 second they were driving. The next, everything was chaos. Todd told investigators that after the pipe struck his wife, he pulled over immediately. He said he ripped the pipe out with his bare hands, smashed the remaining glass away, and tried to give Barbara CPR while calling 911. The cuts on his hands and neck, he explained, came from broken glass and panic. He said adrenaline took over. He said he was just trying to save her. At first, his explanation made sense. The pipe was real. The windshield was broken. Barbara's injuries were catastrophic. Paramedics rushed her to Gunderson Health System in La Crosse, where surgeons worked for hours to save her life. Todd followed, sitting with their children, repeating the same story again and again. To everyone around him, he looked exactly how a grieving husband should look. Shaken, cooperative, heartbroken. There was no immediate reason to doubt him. Accidents happen. Rare ones. Terrible ones. But as deputies returned to the crash site to document the scene more carefully, the story that seemed so clear at first began to raise quiet questions. Because for an accident caused by a falling object on a public road, there was no truck, no debris trail, and no one else who saw it happen. And that was only the beginning. As the initial shock wore off, investigators focused on something that should have been easy to confirm: the truck. According to Todd, a flatbed carrying heavy metal pipes had been traveling in the opposite direction when one of those pipes came loose and flew into their car. It was a frightening claim, but also a specific one. So deputies went looking. They canvassed the area along County Highway M. They checked nearby roads. They asked residents if they had seen a truck carrying metal that morning. They issued public requests for information, expecting anyone, to come forward. No one did. In a rural community where unusual events are noticed and talked about, the absence was striking. A truck losing a large metal pipe on a public road should have left signs. Damage. Debris. Reports. A driver coming forward in panic. There was nothing. Even more puzzling was the surveillance footage. The same camera that had captured Todd and Barbara driving past at 7:57 a.m. showed no oncoming flatbed truck around that time. No vehicle that matched Todd's description. No sign of the object that had supposedly caused the crash. Then came another detail. A driver who passed the scene shortly after the incident told investigators something unexpected. From their vantage point, the Camry's windshield did not appear shattered, and they didn't see anyone outside the vehicle. That detail conflicted with Todd's timeline. Investigators returned to the scene again, walking the roadside inch by inch. They searched for skid marks, fragments, anything that might support the account of a violent impact from a flying object. Again, they found nothing. By the time Barbara passed away in the early hours of the next morning, the case was no longer just about what had happened to her. It was about what hadn't happened at all. And slowly, the idea of a random accident began to fall apart. With the truck still unaccounted for, investigators turned their attention back to the car itself. That's when the scene began to tell a different story. Forensic analysts examined the shattered windshield and the interior of the Camry in detail. What they found didn't line up with Todd's version of events. The distribution of glass across the passenger seat was wrong. Instead of being pressed beneath Barbara's body, the glass was spread evenly across the seat. That meant one thing. When the windshield broke, the passenger seat was empty. If Barbara had been sitting there when the pipe came through the glass, shards should have been trapped beneath her. They weren't. The evidence suggested she wasn't in that seat at the moment the windshield was damaged. Then there was the blood. Analysts studied the patterns carefully. The way blood pooled and flowed showed that Barbara had been bleeding for a period of time while inside the vehicle. Not all at once. Not from a single instant. More disturbing still, the patterns revealed that her body had been moved. At one point, she had been positioned across the center console and toward the passenger side floor. That movement shouldn't have happened if she had been struck instantly and left where she fell. These findings created a timeline that no longer matched Todd's story. The windshield appeared to have been broken after Barbara was already injured. The blood suggested prolonged trauma, not a sudden strike. And the interior told a story of repositioning, not panic. What first looked like a tragic roadside accident was now pointing somewhere else entirely. And the most unsettling realization was this. The car hadn't simply been the place where Barbara was injured. It was part of how the story had been arranged. As the physical evidence raised doubts, investigators waited for the medical findings that would either confirm Todd's story or end it. The autopsy was performed by the county medical examiner. What it revealed erased any remaining belief that Barbara's death was the result of a single, sudden impact. Barbara had suffered multiple injuries to her head and neck. Not one blow, not one point of contact, but repeated trauma. There were deep lacerations to the back of her head, fractures to her skull and nose, and extensive bruising across her body. Her neck showed damage consistent with sustained force. These were not injuries caused by a pipe entering through a windshield. Then came one of the most telling details. There were no glass fragments in Barbara's wounds. If a pipe had broken through the windshield and struck her where she sat, shards of glass should have been embedded in her skin, her hair, her clothing. They weren't. That absence spoke volumes. It meant Barbara was injured before the windshield was broken. It meant the shattered glass wasn't part of the initial attack. It meant the scene had been altered. Taken together, the glass evidence, the blood patterns, and the medical findings, investigators reached a conclusion they could no longer avoid. Barbara Kendhammer was not killed by an accident on the road. She was attacked. And whatever happened to her that morning didn't begin with a flying object. It began somewhere much closer, with someone she trusted. By the end of the autopsy, the case had shifted completely. What started as a crash investigation was now a homicide investigation, and all roads were pointing in one direction. As investigators absorbed the medical examiner's findings, the weight of what they were seeing began to settle in. Barbara's injuries told a story that no staged scene could erase. The trauma to her head showed multiple points of impact, including wounds to areas that would have been nearly impossible to reach from a single object entering through a windshield. By the time the investigation reached this point, the physical evidence had already reshaped the case. But there was another problem investigators couldn't ignore. Todd Kendhammer's story wasn't staying still. In the days following Barbara's death, Todd was interviewed multiple times. At first, his account sounded confident and detailed. But as questions became more specific, small changes began to appear. Details shifted. The reason for the morning drive changed. The exact location of the incident moved slightly. The sequence of what he did after Barbara was injured became less clear. On their own, each change seemed minor. But taken together, they formed a pattern. People who experience trauma often forget details, but they don't usually replace them with new ones. Investigators noticed that Todd's explanations appeared to adjust depending on what evidence was being discussed. When asked about the glass, he emphasized panic. When asked about the blood, he emphasized urgency. When asked about the missing truck, he suggested it must have driven away without stopping. Yet no matter how many times the story was told, one crucial piece never appeared. The truck itself. Law enforcement widened the search. They reviewed traffic routes. They checked nearby businesses. They followed up on tips from the public. Every lead ended the same way. No flatbed. No loose cargo. No driver. In a case built entirely on the existence of a single vehicle, its absence became impossible to ignore. Investigators began to consider a hard truth. If the truck didn't exist, then neither did the accident. And that meant the story Todd had told from the very beginning wasn't failing because of stress or confusion. It was failing because it wasn't true. With the physical evidence laid out and Todd's story continuing to shift, investigators began assembling the only explanation that fit every detail. According to their reconstruction, whatever happened to Barbara did not occur on the roadside. It happened before the car ever stopped. The injuries suggested she was attacked inside the vehicle. The blood patterns showed she remained alive for a period of time after being injured. The lack of glass in her wounds confirmed the windshield was broken later. Investigators believed Barbara was beaten while the car was still moving or shortly after it stopped. Struck multiple times, unable to defend herself, overwhelmed by someone sitting just inches away. Only after she was incapacitated did the staging begin. The windshield was shattered deliberately. The pipe was positioned to create a believable explanation. The car was pulled to the side of the road. Even Todd's own injuries fit the theory. The cuts and bruises on his hands were consistent with breaking glass and handling sharp edges, not with a sudden roadside impact. From the outside, the scene looked chaotic. Up close, it looked controlled. Every piece of evidence that once supported Todd's story now pointed in the opposite direction. The car, the pipe, the injuries, none of it matched an accident caused by a passing truck. Instead, it matched something far more personal. Something that happened in close quarters, without witnesses, without warning. By this point, investigators were no longer asking if the scene had been staged. They were asking why, and how a man who appeared to have everything had reached a moment where violence replaced the life he had spent decades building. As the case against Todd Kendhammer grew stronger, investigators ran into a problem that complicated everything. There was no obvious motive. They dug into the Kendhammers' finances. There were no major debts, no signs of desperation. They spoke with friends, neighbors, co-workers, anyone who might have seen tension behind closed doors. They found nothing. There were no reports of abuse, no documented arguments, no history of violence. To everyone who knew them, Todd and Barbara were steady, comfortable, content. They had recently become grandparents. They were planning for the future. From the outside, their lives appeared calm and settled. Even their children stood firmly by their father. Jessica and Jordan publicly defended Todd, insisting he would never hurt their mother. To them, the idea was unthinkable. The man they knew had been present, supportive, and devoted for as long as they could remember. Prosecutors acknowledged this reality. This was not a case built on jealousy, money, or a long trail of warning signs. There were no angry messages, no secret life uncovered, no obvious breaking point. And yet, the evidence refused to bend. The only documented violence in the Kendhammer marriage existed on Barbara's body. Her injuries told a story that no background check could soften. Whatever happened that morning was intense, sustained, and deliberate, which forced investigators to confront a difficult truth. Sometimes, the most dangerous situations are the ones that leave no visible trace until it's too late. And sometimes, the person capable of extreme violence is the last one anyone expects. By the time prosecutors finalized their case, the picture was no longer complicated. It was precise. They argued that Barbara Kendhammer was attacked before the car ever became part of the story, that the violence happened in close proximity, without witnesses, and left injuries no accident could explain. According to the prosecution, Todd struck Barbara multiple times, causing severe head and neck injuries. While she was still alive, he repositioned her body inside the car. Blood evidence showed movement. Time passed. Then came the staging. The windshield was deliberately broken. The metal pipe was used to create a visual explanation, something shocking enough to distract from the truth. The car was pulled to the side of the road, and only then was the 911 call placed. Every detail Todd offered investigators was addressed. The missing truck? It never existed. The glass cuts? Consistent with breaking the windshield. The panic? Carefully timed. Prosecutors emphasized that this wasn't a random act or a moment of confusion. It required decisions, actions taken in sequence, thought given to how the scene would look when help arrived. They pointed out that the story worked, at least at first, because it was dramatic and unusual. It gave people something external to blame. But science doesn't respond to emotion. Physics, blood analysis, and medical evidence all led to the same conclusion. What happened to Barbara Kendhammer was not the result of chance. It was the result of deliberate choices made by the one person who was supposed to keep her safe. And soon, a jury would be asked to decide whether those choices amounted to murder. Todd Kendhammer's trial began in December 2017, more than a year after Barbara's death. By then, the case had transformed from a tragic accident into one of the most closely watched trials in the area. The courtroom was filled with family members, community residents, and reporters, all trying to reconcile the man sitting at the defense table with the evidence they were about to hear. The prosecution presented its case methodically. Jurors were shown how the glass patterns proved the passenger seat was empty when the windshield broke. They heard experts explain how blood flow and spatter revealed Barbara had been moved after she was injured. The medical examiner testified that her wounds were inconsistent with a single impact and showed signs of repeated trauma. Accident reconstruction specialists walked the jury through the physics, explaining why a pipe could not have entered the windshield in the way Todd described. Piece by piece, the story of a roadside accident collapsed. The defense argued that Todd was a grieving husband caught in an unimaginable situation. They suggested his inconsistencies were the result of shock and stress. Their experts challenged the conclusions of the prosecution's analysts and argued that unusual accidents, while rare, can happen. Then Todd took the stand. He maintained his story. He spoke about the drive, the pipe, the panic, and the helplessness he said he felt watching his wife bleed. He denied harming Barbara and insisted the entire case was built on misinterpretation. But under cross-examination, the same issues surfaced again. There was still no truck, no witness, no physical evidence that supported his account. On December 15, 2017, after deliberating, the jury returned with its verdict. Todd Kendhammer was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide. The courtroom fell silent as the decision was read. For Barbara's family, it marked the end of one nightmare and the beginning of another. And the story was not over yet. In March 2018, Todd Kendhammer stood before the court once again. This time, there would be no arguments, no experts, no reconstruction of what happened on that quiet road. Only the consequences of the verdict. The judge sentenced Todd to life in prison, with the possibility of supervision after 30 years. For the West Salem community, the sentence brought a sense of closure, but not peace. The idea that a man with no public history of violence could commit such an act left many struggling to understand how well they truly knew the people around them. For Barbara's children, the outcome was devastating. Jessica and Jordan had defended their father from the beginning. They believed in him. They stood by him through the trial. And now, they were forced to face a reality that shattered everything they thought they knew about their family. Todd continued to maintain his innocence. Over the years, he filed appeals and requests for post-conviction relief, arguing that the evidence had been misinterpreted and that investigators had drawn the wrong conclusions. Each attempt was denied. The courts stood by the science. Barbara Kendhammer was 46 years old when her life ended. She was a wife, a mother, a grandmother, someone who brought warmth into ordinary places and never imagined her final moments would unfold the way they did. What happened on County Highway M remains one of the most haunting cases in Wisconsin, not because it was random, but because it wasn't. It reminds us that some truths don't reveal themselves through emotion or appearances, only through what cannot be explained away. And sometimes, the most convincing stories are the ones built to hide something else entirely. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you want more true crime stories like this one, carefully researched and clearly told.